FromSoftware has went back and forth between two different spell systems, the FP bar and the limited casts. And in today's video, we're going to break down the pros and cons for both systems, how the spell systems tie into like the power system as a whole, and why I believe neither system will make a return in their next game. Now, on the surface, it might seem like the FP bar or the MP bar is just better. You get more freedom in how much you want to use a spell, the cost of the spells can be overcome much easier, and it's far more simple to keep track of. However, there was a reason why Dark Souls 1 shifted away from this system since coming from Demon Souls, and I believe those reasons have to do with the balancing. Demon Souls spells were so incredibly broken. They all did insane damage, consumed no stamina, didn't require catalyst upgrades, and the items used to regenerate FP could be bought infinitely for a very cheap price. So when Dark Souls released, they probably thought that this system was too broken for PvE and especially PvP, which I do feel like was their biggest reason, but either way the game was incredibly unbalanced in favor of using spells, as there was basically no downside, especially compared to that of using a melee weapon. So they needed to have a restriction put in place, whether it be the spells doing less damage or the spells not being as easily spammed, and they decided on the latter. Dark Souls 1 spells are still incredibly powerful, and I do feel that this is by design, because in a game where it has more of like a traditional medieval setting, using these insane magical abilities should just feel more powerful. Like just from a pure optics standpoint, a big lightning spear should 100% be doing more damage than a straight sword, especially in a world like this one. So despite the lack of freedoms of being able to spam your favorite spells all the time, at least they're guaranteed to be powerful and feel good in the moments that you can use them. And the fact that they are limited makes you play in a much more creative way, which I do believe is the single biggest reason why people might prefer this system instead. Because looking at games like Demon Souls and Elden Ring, where you can just spam the same one spell throughout the entire game, it's understandable why some people might not like that. Now, nothing is stopping these people from still using multiple different spells and not always having to use the most optimal thing. However, there is a massive difference between utilizing what the game has to offer just to overcome a challenge, compared to purposefully using the less optimal method just so you don't have that repetitive or easy experience. Like in one circumstance, you're using your smarts to overcome a challenge, and in the other, you're purposefully being dumb to create a challenge. Now that's obviously in very simplified terms. For a lot of people, it's not going to be that deep. We all play these games for different reasons, and a lot of people aren't going to have that overarching feeling of, I'm not maximizing my build potential, and I feel that that's a problem. Some people just don't really care for that. And when it does come to a game like Elden Ring, the game is going to be challenging no matter what. Like, that's just based on the balancing philosophy of the game. All the enemies and circumstances that you will be in will be very tough, but the game gives you lots and lots of materials to make it as easy or as challenging as possible. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the whole balancing talks about Elden Ring. Many people like it, some people don't. It's always going to be a subjective matter. But yeah, basically the entire premise of what I'm getting at is that you have your freedoms stripped away, and then you have to try and counter that, which I've talked about the curse of freedoms in my videos beforehand, and this is definitely true here. Now, when it comes to Dark Souls 2, this game also has that limited spellcasting system, but the balancing of the spells couldn't be any further from Dark Souls 1. The Dark Souls 2 spells are heavily nerfed in the damage department, the stamina usage. You have to now upgrade the catalysts and actually have them be infused to maximize your damage. And this is to the point that even your hardest hitting spells only be tickling some of these endgame and these DLC bosses. And I do feel like the damage of these spells being weaker compared to Dark Souls 1 is intentional, because the game has more of like a fantasy element to compared to Dark Souls 1. Like all the unique and cool looking weapons and magical bosses, it kind of makes sense that the spells perform very similar to the weapons. Whereas not like in Dark Souls 1 where like your spells can be just doing so much more damage. But despite this change in their damage, they still decided to keep the limited cast system. And honestly, I feel like they wanted to have an FP bar for this game, but they just ended up settling on this instead. Maybe it's because it's more simple to carry over from Dark Souls 1. Maybe it's because they wanted players to utilize more variation of spells and test out all like the unique spells they had out there. But unfortunately for Dark Souls 2, I think the forced to use different spells thing kind of backfired on them, because they decided to have the spells be a lot weaker. So if all the spells aren't going to be doing this insane damage per hit, they're going to end up valuing the more efficient spells instead. And that's why 90% of spell builds out there that people use just involves using things like Dark Orb and having dozens of casts of that. And if they do use differing spell types, it's just going to end up being different variations of the exact same projectile attack. So this game still ends up falling under the category of needing to purposely use the unoptimal method just for the sake of not spamming the exact same attack, which is just like in Demon Souls or in Elden Ring. Now, this is definitely mainly for PvE. In PvP, I feel like the variety of spells work a lot better, and that's probably the main reason why they didn't shift back to the FP system. But it just doesn't feel as satisfying when you only get a couple of casts of Forbidden Sun or Sunlight Spear, and then when you go ahead and use a weapon, you can just melt these bosses way faster. So when it came to moving on to Dark Souls 3, it made perfect sense to just revert back to the FP system, especially because in Dark Souls 2, you already have items to replenish your casts, and you got more casts by leveling your attunement, which when you think about it, that's very similar to just having an FP bar. There is level progression behind being able to use the spells more often. Now, I did mention how limited casts make you think more about how you plan out using your spells, but one thing that the FP allows you to do is plan out more in the leveling process, like worrying about soft caps or fine-tuning your FP costs for a certain build. For example, if you wanted to use a spell like Sunlight Spear in Dark Souls 3, this consumes 48 FP. Realistically, you'd want to be able to cast this spell at least 4 times before replenishing your FP, so speccing into 26 attunement should be something that you should prioritize. So it does add a different element from that perspective. Now, the Dark Souls 3 spells still perform very similar in terms of damage to the Dark Souls 2 counterparts. There's going to be some very solid options, and there's going to be some others that just hit like a wet noodle. But what the FP system now allows you to do is run a pure caster build. You can now kill all the enemies in a given location and probably still have enough FP to kill a boss. Obviously, assuming you actually have enough FP flasks, which that system of having the heals merged together is the biggest difference in this FP system compared to the Demon Souls FP system. And this healing discrepancy makes the system be very simple and streamlined, which, like streamlining things for accessibility, was definitely at the forefront of the Dark Souls 3 design philosophy. And that's definitely not a bad thing. Simplifying something for accessibility isn't necessarily going to be simplifying the mastery of the game too, but there are going to be some balancing issues that do come alongside this change. If you do want to go into a hybrid-based playstyle, you typically are splitting your stats to go into weapon damage and then spell damage. So the spells that are already not hitting that hard are not going to be at the forefront of your build. So the damage is just going to end up being very disappointing when you go with these hybrid playstyles. So to really benefit off this playstyle, you'll have to spec into a lot more FP flasks, which inherently sacrifices your healing flasks. And this just makes the playstyle just be very unappealing to a lot of people. So Dark Souls 3 pretty much made it to where you're either going all into weapons or all into spells, because I feel like there's far too big of a trade-off when you're going into both. So I'm not entirely sure why they didn't add another upgrade system for the FP flask and not have it intertwined with the healing flask. Maybe it's because they didn't want to encourage people like easily spamming projectile attacks in a game that's not really balanced for that. Like the enemy AI definitely works best and is most complex when you are close to them. Or like maybe they did this because it was just very simple and easy to understand. But there is another thing that Dark Souls 3 did that probably made FromSoftware realize that they do want to have an FP bar, and that is weapon skills. It felt like a very natural progression to have every weapon get a unique type of attack after Dark Souls 2 added a lot of like these unique heavy attacks. It just helps the fantasy aspect of the game, and it helps give the weapon like a bit more personality. Now in Dark Souls 1 and 2, these unique attacks were balanced behind having them consume durability, which if that were still to be the case, then everybody would just be going around stacking up on repair powder. But I feel like it was a lot better to merge them into a separate cost category that didn't feel like it was overlapping with the actual weapon usage itself. Like it's easy to manage an FP bar and know when to stop, where there's a lot more risk involved if it comes to durability, which I think it is completely unnecessary to have the player be afraid to use weapon skills that for the most part are only meant for utility anyway. Now, having both spells and skills tied behind FP is once again made to be very simple and streamlined, but it does hurt a bit of the creativity that you can do with your build if you wanted to utilize both skills and spells, which to be fair, there aren't many builds where you would want to do that, but also this combining all the unique attacks into one cost category isn't anything new, and it's something that FromSoftware hasn't really cared to flesh out. Like Bloodborne, for example, has not only your gun consume bullets, but some of the weapons and your tools consume the bullets too, which I feel like that system just hurts Bloodborne a lot more compared to the skills and spells, because there are a lot of builds out there where you want to be able to utilize multiple of these things. The tool system was something I always wished FromSoft or Japan Studios would just put more effort into, because having them just be items that consume bullets definitely felt unfinished, especially before the DLC came out. Like, there was lots of questionable choices when it came to like the power system and mainly the build creation in this game, but that can be a conversation for another video. However, just like the bullets in Bloodborne, we have Sekiro doing the exact same thing with the spirit emblems. Now, the combat art and the prosthetic tools feel a lot more fleshed out in this game when compared to the hunter tools, but it also just doesn't make sense to me that they both consume the exact same item. It just makes the playstyle be a lot more limiting as you're choosing between one or the other. And going back to the main point that I made for the limited spell casts in Dark Souls 1, the spirit emblems don't offer that same feeling of maximizing your limited resources, and instead this system encourages you to spam the one thing over and over, and you'll never get that feeling of utilizing all your assets unless you want to just nerf yourself. Obviously, there are going to be niche circumstances where this is not going to be the case, but there's plenty of times where you just feel like I don't want to use any ninjutsu here because I'd rather just hold onto my spirit emblems for my combat arts instead. And also, I don't know why we didn't at least get a system like in Bloodborne that allows you to replenish bullets as a part of your base kit, and instead we got like a worse version of that tied behind an item. That was kind of annoying, and it has made the combats feel even like more restrictive to just deflecting everything and then save your finite items for a boss. It's very rare that FromSoftware actually strikes the balance where the game can have you play optimally, but you don't necessarily have to spam the same attack. But speaking of spamming the exact same attacks, we have Elden Ring. There is no other game that incentivizes spamming the same button as much as this one. However, this is definitely the best type of spamming the exact same button, as it does have the most variation of spam. Whether it be spamming the exact same broken spell, or weapon skill, jumping attacks, heavy attacks, guard counters, you have so much variation of like broken or viable builds, but the way that the game is balanced, it just encourages you to spam the same button to maximize DPS, and you kind of lose out a lot on these more unique and hybrid-based playstyles. So needless to say, despite it having the same system as Dark Souls 3, the final product is a lot further apart from a build creation standpoint, and that is mainly due to the largeness of the game. There are lots of different items implemented to make your character just be very broken. Now, how many of these items you can realistically get in a blind playthrough to make yourself be broken will differ from person to person, but it makes sense that the potential to be broken is very high in a game that's as grand and as cinematic as this one. I don't feel like the basic Dark Souls 1 system would really work as well in this game. So despite all these games having like a similar style and feel from a genre perspective, they all have very different inherent designs from a combat and build creation standpoint. And I do appreciate that they're all different, and it feels like the games that they make are a direct response to the games made prior. Now the question stands, which way do we go from here? Dark Souls 1 was the most balanced game in my opinion, from the perspective that it had its vision on how powerful they wanted to have the spells, and then they executed that with respect to how often you're allowed to spam the same spell or attacks. But now we are here with Elden Ring, and it's like a complete 180. We have so much more variety in spells to fill every single niche use under the sun, and you can make a case for almost every single spell's existence. But even then, almost every spell just isn't really worth using over some of the other top options, because the uses that they have are far too niche, and the spell casting system across the Souls games have never been kind to mixing up different spells for different circumstances. Like, I'd love to be able to freely use something like Carrion Piercer to send some enemies flying, then quickly switch to Carrion Slicer to clean up the next enemy, then use Fleeting Microcosm to kill a group at a distance, or Rings of Spectral Lights to hit an enemy far away. Like, the game definitely does peak when you have all these different spells for different uses, and then quickly switch between all of them. But there is a problem with this, and that is you can't easily use different spells on demand. They still use the exact same toggling system as in Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls, and those spells have way less variety of spells than in Elden Ring. And also in Elden Ring, you have fully designed pure caster builds. It's not really as it is in the earlier games, where they're kind of meant to be like secondary to your main melee build. Like, these spell builds are just as powerful and as prevalent as the best melee builds in the entire game. Yet, it doesn't really get a good spell combat system. In my opinion, I do think the best iteration of a spell casting system that we have had has been Lords of the Fallen. Having dedicated buttons for casting and having ranged options for strength and dexterity, or using different types of ammunition, not just all of them using FP, I think that system was definitely the best. And the thing is, FromSoft could easily make something better than this for their next major release. So I don't think our next major game after Duskbloods will be a traditional Souls game at all. I feel like we see something a lot more unique from a power system perspective. Whether it's be a system where you have like timed cooldowns, or having an FP bar that gets filled through combats like in Liza P. It could be cool if you could build upon the system, like having your catalyst give you passive boosts to certain spells, by now potentially having like unique passive effects by having certain spells in combination together. Like for instance, using something like Discus of Light and Radagon's Ring of Light on the exact same build gave you like an additional passive effect. I think something like that could help incentivize using a wider variety of spells. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't put it past FromSoftware to eventually end up making a combat more engaging than any other FromSoft game or Souls-like game that we've had so far. But all I know is that the current system can only carry them so far because the abundance of items that they have in Elden Ring, and matched with the freedoms that you have in that game, are just not going to be sustainable from a game development standpoint. There just needs to be a lot more innovation to push the genre forward. And I feel that FromSoftware see that as well. Hence the different types of games they've been making and not rehashing the exact same concepts in a sequel. So I definitely am excited for what the future holds for FromSoftware. I don't think their next game is going to be something like as huge or cinematic as Elden Ring. I definitely think they're going to try and create a brand new concept and like a new sub-genre, like creating the next generation Demon Souls, and then building upon that. Because yeah, FromSoftware has continuously made this very original concepts when it does come to this gaming and combat, that I can only really see them as innovators. Anyway, that's basically everything I wanted to talk about in this one. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. And if you do like this type of content, please do like and subscribe, because I will have some more coming out along the way. But yeah, catch you guys in the next one. See yous.